Snow came down sideways in Loch Dhu, needling the harbour and frosting the stone cottages until the village looked preserved in ice. Hogmanay had just passed, and with it the town's brief, brave cheer. At first light on New Year's Day, the bells were still and the streets empty, except for the one house that did not answer its door. The house belonged to Angus Calder, a man known for making promises loudly and keeping them quietly, if at all. He had hosted the midnight gathering, raised a glass to the year ahead, and sworn, before witnesses and whiskey, that he would put things right. By dawn, he was dead. Hamish Macbeth arrived as the lock was being forced, the smell of the sea and peat smoke clinging to his coat. Inside, the sitting room was neat to the point of severity. The fire had burned low. A chair lay on its side as if nudged rather than thrown. Angus Calder sat upright at the small dining table, eyes open, lips parted, a half-written note before him. There was no blood, no sign of a struggle, no weapon. The doors were bolted from the inside, the windows latched, their sills dusted with untouched snow. The doctor shook his head. Heart attack, maybe, or poison, or something stranger. Angus had been healthy enough to outdrink 3 men the night before. The villagers murmured and crossed themselves. Locked rooms made people uneasy in Loch Dhu. They suggested cleverness, and cleverness suggested malice. Hamish studied the note. The ink had bled where the pen paused, as though the writer had hesitated. "I promise I will—" and then nothing. The pen lay beside the paper, uncapped, dry at the tip. If Angus had collapsed mid-sentence, the pen should have fallen, rolled, left a mark. It hadn't moved. On the mantelpiece sat a small glass bowl filled with coins, first-foot money, left by tradition to bring luck into the house. Every coin gleamed except one, darkened and worn smooth, older than the rest. Hamish picked it up and turned it between his fingers. It was warm, as though recently handled, which made no sense in a cold room where a dead man had sat alone all night. The doctor finished his cursory exam and straightened. No marks, no smell, no obvious cause. He glanced at the bowl. Money there since midnight? So they say, Hamish replied. And the doors? Bolted from the inside. Windows? Snow's clean. Too simple, Hamish thought, which made it impossibly complex. Angus Calder had enemies, men he'd cheated, promises he'd broken, but none with the patience for a locked-room trick. And then there was the promise itself, hanging in the air like smoke that refused to clear. People had laughed when Angus made it, because he always made them, and always failed. But someone had taken it seriously. Hamish moved through the house again, slow as a cat, noticing what wasn't there. No food on the table, though the gathering had lasted late. No empty glass near Angus's hand. The kitchen sink was clean, the cloth neatly folded. Someone had tidied after midnight, or Angus had, which didn't fit the man. Outside, the sea boomed against the rocks. A gull cried. The village waited, pretending not to watch. Hamish slipped the dark coin into his pocket and looked once more at the unfinished sentence. Promises, he knew, were dangerous things. They bound people tighter than locks. And somewhere between midnight and dawn, in a house sealed against the world, one promise had been collected. Hamish stepped back into the cold and let the door close gently behind him, listening to the bolts slide home. The sound was clean, certain, too certain. Inside, death had waited politely. Outside, Loch Dhu pretended this was any other New Year morning. Curtains twitched. Someone dropped a bucket with unnecessary force. News travelled fast in a village, but truth walked slowly. The constable from the neighbouring town arrived puffing and officious, notebook already open. He circled the house, noted the locks, the windows, the snow. No entry, no exit, he said with satisfaction, as though that settled something. We'll list the guests from last night. Check alibis. Standard. Aye, Hamish said mildly. He was crouched by the front step studying the snow. It was clean except for a faint scuff, barely more than a shadow, right beside the threshold. Not a footprint, more like something brushed away. A broom, perhaps, or a careful shoe sole. Routine didn't notice shadows. Inside again, Hamish drifted where others marched. He touched nothing, but he looked at everything. The coins in the bowl had been placed deliberately, heads facing up except the dark one, which had been dropped carelessly on its edge before settling. A habit, not a thought. Someone nervous fumbled. Angus Calder, for all his faults, was precise about money. The constable interviewed the doctor in low tones. Hamish watched the doctor's hands. They trembled slightly when he spoke of natural causes, steadied when he spoke of procedure. Fear made hands shake. Habit calmed them. The doctor was afraid of being wrong, not of being involved. The guests began to gather outside. Those who had first footed the house after midnight, bearing coal, bread, whisky. Morag Calder, Angus's sister, stood apart, her mouth set tight as if she'd bitten into something sour, and decided to endure it. When Hamish asked her about the promise, she laughed too quickly. He promised every year, she said. Promised to change, promised to pay, promised to stop. It's nothing. But this time, Hamish said gently, he started to write it down. Her eyes flicked toward the window, then back. He was drunk. Not enough to spill ink, Hamish replied. Further down the line stood Ewan Ross, a fisherman with a temper as short as his patience. He'd argued with Angus before midnight, loud enough for the whole room to hear. When Hamish mentioned the dark coin, Ewan's jaw tightened. Old thing, he said. Angus liked to pretend he had history. But you handled it, Hamish said. Ewan blinked. Everyone handled it. No, Hamish said softly. Only one coin's warm in a cold house. Ewan opened his mouth, closed it, then laughed. Too late. The laugh came after the fear, not before. Hamish filed that away. Back inside, the constable frowned at the note again. If he died writing, where's the cause? Hamish leaned closer to the paper. The ink bled oddly at the last word, feathering more than the rest. Moisture, he thought. Not sweat, something added. He sniffed. A faint sweetness lingered, masked by peat smoke. Honey? Syrup? Something that invited rather than attacked. In the kitchen, Hamish finally found what bothered him most. A kettle sat cold on the stove, lid askew. Beside it, a single spoon, washed clean but placed wrong side up in the drying rack. Angus was careless but not backward. Someone had made a drink and cleaned the evidence, forgetting only that habit reveals itself in small mistakes. Outside, Morag Calder was crying now, real tears at last. Ewan stared at the sea as if daring it to contradict him. The village shifted, uneasy. Hamish looked back at the locked door, the tidy room, the promise that had been coaxed onto paper and cut short. Whatever killed Angus Calder had not forced its way in. It had been invited, offered with ceremony, and cleaned up afterward. And someone in Loch Dhu had mistaken a promise for forgiveness. Hamish stepped back into the chill of the street, letting the constable gather the first visitors for questioning. The villagers clustered hesitantly, voices low, like birds murmuring in winter trees. Each face carried a story, and Hamish had learned to listen not just to words but to the gaps between them. He approached Morag Calder first, whose grief had sharpened into a guarded edge. "Did Angus speak to anyone after midnight?" he asked gently. She shook her head. "No one. He went to his room after the singing. I was upstairs too, keeping out of the way. And did anyone come to the house afterward?" "No," she said, but her fingers tightened around the scarf at her neck. "No one. Except Ewan, maybe. But he left quickly. I didn't see him go in or out." Hamish noted the hesitation. Morag wasn't lying outright, but she was careful. Too careful. Ewan Ross, leaning against a lamp-post, met Hamish's eyes with a flicker of defiance. "I left after the first footing. Nothing more to it. Angus was fine. He had his whiskey, he laughed, he told the same jokes he always does." "Did anyone see you leave?" Hamish asked. "I did. Ewan said immediately. "Aye, others. You can ask." His eagerness was sharp, defensive. People eager to prove themselves innocent often were the first to hide a truth. Hamish moved quietly between them, listening as Mrs. MacLeod, the baker, spoke of strange noises. "I thought I heard someone upstairs," she said, "but I was busy cleaning. Could have been the wind." "Upstairs in Angus's house?" Hamish prompted. "Yes, but," she faltered, "I didn't see anyone, just sounds." Each account had a kernel of truth, but each was coloured differently. Some contradictions were small, timing of departure, the direction of footsteps, but together they hinted at something deliberate. Hamish returned to the doorway, eyes scanning the room. The half-finished note still sat untouched. The coins glinted faintly, the dark one lying stubbornly apart from the rest. Someone had handled it, he reminded himself. Someone who had a reason to be precise yet careless at the same time. He asked about the guests' behaviour at the party. A few laughed too loudly at their own jokes. Others avoided certain topics. He watched gestures, a hand brushing a tear, a frown held too long, a gaze darting to the mantel. Small motions, barely noticeable, but they spoke louder than words. "Did Angus quarrel with anyone last night?" Hamish asked. "Ewan," Morag said immediately, "but that was before the whisky. Just a bit of shouting. You know how men get rowdy. And you?" Hamish asked, turning to her. "I argued once," she admitted slowly. "But it's over now." Hamish made a silent note. Confession delayed, minimised, carefully staged. Some sought sympathy, others coverage, but all concealed something. He circled back to the dark coin. Ewan had noticed it. So had Morag, though she tried not to show it. It was a focus for tension, a small object loaded with meaning, possibly a clue, possibly a misdirection. People reacted differently to it, betraying unease. Hamish spoke quietly with each villager again, piecing together overlaps. The wind outside rattled windows, but inside, an invisible web of half-truths had been spun. Someone in Loch-Dhu knew more than they admitted. Someone who had handled promises like weapons. And the detective could feel it, like a shadow stretching from the mantel to the hearth, across the coins, into each hesitating glance. Every word, every contradiction was a thread. Pulling it carefully would reveal more than just a motive. It might expose the hand that had closed the room from the inside and left a promise unfinished, waiting for Hamish to unravel it. Hamish stepped back into the sitting room once more, letting the cold from the street brush against his cheeks. He had spent hours listening, watching, noting reactions that others would dismiss as quirks or nerves. Now it was time to think about why someone would want Angus Calder dead, or at least silenced in the most careful, deliberate way imaginable. The first thread was obvious: greed. Angus had been a stubborn man, yes, but he was also miserly, keeping careful accounts, hoarding coins, and promising others more than he ever delivered. Some villagers had gambled on his largesse, hoping to inherit favours or debts paid off. Ewan Ross, with his temper and restless hands, had argued about money the night before. That argument had been loud enough to wake the winds outside the windows. Yet Ewan's reaction to the dark coin suggested more than just annoyance. He had a stake, a recognition, perhaps even guilt. Then there was jealousy. Morag Calder's eyes flicked too often toward the mantelpiece, toward the coins, toward the half-written note. Her grief seemed layered, like frost over something darker beneath. She had cared for her brother in ways few acknowledged, and yet her presence carried hints of resentment, promises unkept, past grievances, the quiet knowledge that her brother's affairs had always overshadowed her own. Fear was subtler but no less powerful. The doctor's trembling hands, the quick reassurance, the careful phrasing of his words. He had seen too much, known enough to worry about how even a misstep could cast suspicion. What of the villagers who swore they had been elsewhere, but whose footsteps in the snow left shadows faint and untraceable? Fear made them cautious, careful, yet small gestures betrayed them. Even revenge could be threaded through the night. Angus had broken promises, offended friends, snubbed those who had once trusted him. A slight, a forgotten favour, a cruel word whispered in a heated moment. Anyone could have sparked retribution. And yet, the method of his death was not one of passion. It was calculated, precise, almost ceremonial. The killer had understood him well enough to exploit trust, to enter without forcing doors, to leave a trace small enough to puzzle a casual eye but significant to those who knew what to notice. Hamish pulled the dark coin from his pocket again, turning it between his fingers. It connected to every thread, a token, a signal, a message hidden in plain sight. Who had handled it and why? Every suspect had touched the edges of opportunity, but each had a different reason for hesitating. Ewan, the angry fisherman, could have acted in a flare of resentment or hope for gain. Morag could have seized a moment to assert control, to test a promise, to punish subtly. Even the doctor, though unlikely, had access and knowledge enough to manipulate circumstances under the guise of care. Hamish began laying out the connections in his mind, like mapping the night sky. Every name, every motion, every slip of speech intersected with another. The arguments, the glances, the hesitations, they weren't random. They formed a web, intricate and tangled, designed to obscure the truth even from the sharpest observer. And yet, he saw patterns emerging in the chaos. A coin left warm, a note unfinished, the careful cleaning of evidence. The murderer had motive layered upon motive, a lattice of human emotion hiding behind courtesy and custom. As he traced the paths of anger, greed, jealousy and fear through the village, Hamish realized that the motive itself was a maze but not an endless one. The killer's choices had left subtle but telling signs. Somewhere in the twists, someone had made a crucial mistake, too obvious in their eagerness, too deliberate in their carelessness, too human to resist revealing a small truth. Hamish looked toward the mantel once more, the half-finished promise on the table, the dark coin glinting in the pale light. Every suspect carried a piece of the puzzle, and every piece overlapped with another. Soon, he knew, the threads would begin to pull taut, and the maze of motives would point to a single hand, the one that had guided a promise to its deadly conclusion. Hamish returned to the coins for the third time, turning the dark piece over under the weak winter sun that spilled through the window. The constable had made a fuss over it earlier, declaring it proof that someone had been inside before dawn. They traced it back to Ewan Ross, who had admitted handling it to check the first-foot offerings. And suddenly, the village buzzed with relief. The case, so long in suspense, seemed resolved. Ewan had motive, opportunity, and the coin, a seemingly airtight link. The constable beamed, eager to report the solution. Villagers whispered and nodded, some shaking hands with Ewan, some glancing at him with lingering suspicion. The story was neat, complete, and comforting. An argument, a heated exchange, a mismanaged promise, a rash act. Hamish watched the celebration with quiet unease. Ewan, for his part, played the role expected of him perfectly. He looked guilty enough, confessed enough to satisfy the authorities, and yet there was something in his eyes, a defiance, a confidence, that made Hamish pause. He had seen it before, criminals who knew how to make others do their work. Witnesses who became scapegoats, appearances arranged to mislead. A false victory could be more dangerous than no progress at all. Hamish knelt by the table again, fingers brushing the note. "I promise I will." The words stared back at him, unfinished, unresolved. The pen, the ink, the subtle moisture, the careful cleaning. It was too deliberate for a moment of drunken carelessness. Someone had orchestrated this, left the surface chaos while concealing the hand that delivered the fatal touch. He returned to the kitchen, noting the single spoon placed wrong side up. He remembered the warmth of the dark coin, small, overlooked, yet deliberate. Ewan had touched it, yes, but not in the manner that mattered. The coin's heat was residual, a signature left in passing, not in commission. The real culprit had used the coin to misdirect, to frame the fisherman, leaving the authorities to celebrate a solution that was only convenient, not true. Hamish watched the villagers begin to disperse, their chatter filling the cold air with false security. The constable was already scribbling his report, eager to close the case, eager for recognition. "Simple solution, Hamish," he said. "Anger and opportunity, that's all it was." Hamish smiled faintly. "Simple sometimes hides the cleverest design," he said, letting the words hang like mist over the snow. He retraced his steps through the house, slow and deliberate. Every movement mattered. His eyes lingered on the unfinished promise, the position of the coins, the carefully wiped surfaces. The orchestration was subtle, refined, too calculated for an impulsive act. The real killer remained outside the scrutiny of the law, watching, perhaps confident that Hamish was misled like everyone else. Night fell, and with it came a deeper silence. The village, lulled into comfort by the apparent resolution, was blind to the lingering threat. Hamish stood at the doorway, the wind tugging at his coat, and felt the pulse of deception beneath the stillness. He had a sense now, instinct honed over years, that the solution so eagerly embraced was a shadow of the truth, a mask the murderer had worn carefully for hours, and somewhere in Loch someone moved unseen, waiting for the right moment. They had played their part perfectly, leaving just enough evidence to convince the inexperienced, just enough confusion to delight the authorities. Hamish clenched his coat tighter and glanced at the dark coin on the table. This wasn't over. The false victory was a trap, and he intended to follow its threads until he found the hand that had set it. Even as the village exhaled in relief, Hamish knew the real danger had not yet revealed itself. The promise remained unfinished, and the killer was still watching, patient and precise, in the shadows that stretched long across the frozen streets. Hamish lingered in the empty house long after the villagers had departed, listening to the faint creak of settling timber and the sigh of wind through the eaves. He returned once more to the mantelpiece, letting his eyes trace the familiar outlines of the coins, the half-finished note, the objects left as if arranged for him to discover. Then, almost absent-mindedly, he touched the corner of a faded photograph tucked behind a frame, a picture of Angus Calder with a group of villagers decades earlier, faces he recognized and some he did not, but one in particular drew his attention, a young man with a sharp, guarded expression, standing beside a younger Ewan Ross. The photograph had been tucked away, ignored for years, yet now it seemed to hum with significance. Hamish remembered a rumour, whispered long ago, about a dispute over the town's fishing rights, a quarrel that had turned bitter and personal, a promise broken, a debt unpaid, an insult left to fester. The coincidence was too sharp to ignore. He examined the faces closely, the same temper in the eyes, the same careful posture. Connections stretched across decades, linking Angus, Ewan, and another figure he had not considered important before, Morag Calder. Memories returned, whispers of a scandal long buried, a minor theft, accusations that had never reached the courts. Ewan had been involved in those old disputes, and Morag had always seemed protective of her family's reputation, ready to conceal missteps that might tarnish the name of Calder. These weren't separate threads. They were one woven tapestry, tied together by history, by grudges, and by promises that had never been honoured. Hamish felt the familiar thrill of discovery. The dark coin, the half-written note, the meticulous staging, they were not just symbols of a single evening's conflict. They were echoes of old resentments, carefully resurrected and brought forward like a shadow that stretched across the years. Someone had known, remembered, and waited for the precise moment to act. He returned to the villagers, observing their interactions, listening again to fragments of conversation that earlier had seemed trivial. Ewan joked with a friend, but the laugh was stiff, too measured. Morag oversaw arrangements for the funeral with a practiced composure that barely concealed a twitch of impatience. Every gesture hinted at history, alliances, and buried disputes. The events of last night, so carefully staged, were part of a continuum, not a spontaneous act. Hamish walked to the edge of the harbour, letting the cold wind strip his thoughts bare. The sea stretched endless, relentless. The past, he realised, had its own currents, ones that could drag old conflicts into the present, violent and unexpected. The promise that had drawn Angus to the table, the coin left warm, the meticulous cleaning, they were all guided by knowledge born decades before, by grudges and debts no one alive now could recall in full. He returned once more to the house, crouching by the fireplace. A small scratch on the mantel, a detail no one had noticed before, caught his eye. It matched a mark on the back of the dark coin. The coincidence was impossible. Someone had brought this object forward, linking present events to old patterns. Hamish understood now. The killer had exploited history, turning memories into tools of misdirection, using familiarity to frame suspicion and disguise intent. The realization tightened his chest. This wasn't just about greed, jealousy, or immediate resentment. The crime had roots, deep and winding, and it required understanding of old relationships, old arguments, old betrayals. Whoever had planned this had waited, watched, and remembered, shaping the present to fit a pattern forged years ago. The shadows of the past were long, and they had stretched their fingers across Loch Dhu, reaching into the house, the coins, and the promise left unfinished. Hamish stood, staring out the window at the darkening streets. The solution the authorities celebrated was comforting, convenient, but it ignored the web spun long ago. And the real culprit, guided by memory and motive alike, still lingered unseen, ready to act again if misjudged. The past was alive in this house, and it demanded attention before the next shadow fell. Hamish returned to the Calder house before dawn, the snow crunching under his boots like dry paper. The village slept, or pretended to, leaving the streets empty and still. Inside, the room seemed smaller in the grey light, the shadows deeper in the corners. He placed the dark coin carefully on the table and let it sit, untouched, a quiet signal more than an object. Then he waited. He didn't call anyone in, didn't announce his presence. Instead, he allowed the scene to speak in its silence. The half-finished note, coins, the faint marks on the mantel, they were all pieces of a puzzle designed to provoke recognition. Sometimes the mind reveals itself when it thinks no one is watching. Hamish had learned to manipulate that subtle mechanism. People often betrayed themselves when confronted by their own handiwork, even without knowing it. When Morag Calder arrived to check on some forgotten detail of the house, she froze in the doorway. Her eyes went first to the note, then to the coin, and her fingers fidgeted with the scarf at her neck. Hamish observed quietly, letting her composure slip slowly. "Funny," he said casually, as though to himself, "how some coins seem warmer than others, even in this cold." Morag's eyes flicked sharply toward him, but she said nothing. Hamish didn't press. He merely placed a small magnifying glass over the coin, pretending to inspect it carefully. He let the light from the window catch it just so, giving the impression that he sought something technical, something scientific. "Warm," he repeated softly, almost as if someone had held it for longer than they should have. Or someone had touched it deliberately. Morag's hand twitched almost imperceptibly toward the fireplace. Hamish noticed the movement, the hesitation, the way her fingers froze halfway. A tiny crack, a fragment of reaction, but enough. Her breath hitched slightly. "Deliberate," she whispered, almost to herself. Hamish turned slowly, letting his eyes meet hers. "Yes," he said, voice low and measured, "and it isn't just the coin. The note, the placement of the chairs, the pen. It's a pattern. Someone orchestrated the whole scene to guide suspicion, and yet... He paused, letting the thought linger like fog. Small habits are harder to hide than intentions. Morag's lips pressed together. Her posture shifted, rigid and tense, as if she were calculating her next move. Hamish saw the tell, a subtle nod to herself, a signal of recognition, and an unsteady blink that betrayed anxiety. "Curious," he murmured, stepping closer but remaining careful, non-threatening. "You've seen this before, haven't you? This method, these little clues. Someone who knows how to stage suspicion, how to manipulate appearances." Her breath caught. She opened her mouth, closed it, and then stepped back, her composure cracking for the briefest instant. Hamish filed the reaction away, noting how the smallest psychological prod could reveal what hours of questioning could not. He let a few moments pass, watching her try to reset, trying to control her movements, her voice, her expression. The silence did more than questions ever could. Morag shifted again, glancing toward the coin, the note, the mantle, and in that glance, fleeting and unguarded, Hamish saw understanding. She knew that the simple explanations others had embraced were false, that someone else had pulled the strings, and that she had been too close, too connected, to avoid noticing. Hamish straightened, tucking the magnifying glass into his coat. The clue hadn't been the coin itself, the pen, or even the note. It had been her reaction to them. A careful psychological nudge, a test of character, and the tiniest crack appeared in her deception. It was subtle, almost invisible to the untrained eye, but it confirmed what Hamish had suspected all along. The real hand behind Angus Calder's death was still waiting, watching, and counting on appearances to protect them. The morning light brightened slightly through the window, glinting off the coin, illuminating the small, telling cracks of human behaviour, and Hamish knew the next move had to be equally precise. Hamish returned to the house later that morning, intending to examine the dark coin and the note once more. The snow outside had softened to a muted grey, and the village was beginning to stir. He found the door unlocked, though he had left it bolted, but at first glance everything seemed as he had left it. The fire had died to embers, the room cold and the silence thick. Then he saw the note. The half-finished promise had vanished, not a scrap remained. The pen lay on the table uncapped, but the ink had been wiped clean as if nothing had ever been written. The coins, too, had shifted. The dark one was gone. Hamish's pulse quickened. Whoever had tampered with the room knew its significance, knew which pieces of evidence mattered most, and had acted deliberately to erase them. A soft knock at the door startled him. Morag Calder stood there, hands clasped, expression carefully neutral. "I came to fetch something," she said lightly. "Thought I might tidy up a bit." Hamish's eyes narrowed. "Tidy up, or remove what doesn't suit your story?" She blinked. For a moment a flicker of hesitation passed over her face, small enough to seem accidental, but Hamish had learned to read the shadows in hesitation. I don't know what you mean," she said, stepping inside cautiously. He moved toward the empty table, scanning the surfaces, the floor, the mantel. No fingerprints, no smudges. Someone had been careful, far too careful. This wasn't the act of a panicked accomplice. This was intentional, precise, and fastidious. Hamish felt the weight of the challenge settle over him. The evidence he had relied upon, the coin, the note, the subtle markers that had begun to reveal the murderer, was now gone, leaving only questions, and the faint scent of ink and peat smoke lingering in the air. Outside, voices rose in the village square. The constable arrived, breathless, having heard from a neighbour that someone had been seen entering the house while Hamish was away. Hamish studied him carefully. "Did anyone see what they took?" he asked. "Nothing," the constable replied. "Just someone went in and then left. No one saw anything else." Hamish felt the frustration settle like frost in his chest. Someone was actively working against him. Someone who knew the investigation was closing in. The timing was too precise, the choice of evidence too calculated. It was no coincidence. This was sabotage, an attempt to bury the truth before it could be uncovered. He turned back to Morag, who had been standing quietly, hands nervously fidgeting with her scarf. "You saw them?" he asked. I don't know. I didn't notice," she said, though her eyes betrayed a trace of uncertainty, of unease. Hamish filed the subtle reaction away. She either knew more than she admitted, or she had been involved in orchestrating the vanishing act itself. Hamish crouched, scanning the floor for overlooked traces, a smudge, a footprint, a hair, anything that might betray the intruder. The snow outside left faint impressions, but the house itself had been wiped with care. Whoever had done this had anticipated his methods, had understood his scrutiny. He straightened, a grim determination setting in. The disappearance of the note and the coin had raised the stakes. The murderer wasn't just clever. They were watching, manipulating, guiding the investigation from the shadows. Trust was now a fragile thing. Allies could be enemies, and appearances deceived even the most careful eye. Hamish's gaze fell on the empty space where the coin had rested, on the blank table where the promise once lay. The killer had left a message in their absence. The truth would not be easy to claim, and anyone trying to uncover it would be forced to work harder, think sharper, and anticipate moves that had already been anticipated. He knew with a sudden clarity that the next steps would have to be both daring and meticulous, or the real criminal would vanish into the cold Loch Dhu streets and leave him chasing shadows forever. Hamish barely had time to consider the vanishing coin and note before a frantic shout echoed through the village streets. He bolted outside, the wind slicing through his coat, and saw a small crowd gathering near the edge of the harbour. A fisherman pointed shakily toward the water, his face pale and eyes wide. "It's Morag! She's gone! The boat! It's empty!" Hamish pushed through the onlookers, heart hammering. Morag Calder had disappeared. The small fishing skiff she usually kept tied at the dock had drifted, tether lines slapping against the posts in the icy current. The snow on the deck was undisturbed, save for one faint smear of blood near the cleat. The realization hit him like a wave. The killer hadn't finished their game. He scanned the area. The village, still settling from the shock of Angus Calder's death, had been caught unprepared. Whoever had taken Morag knew precisely when to strike, quietly, deliberately, leaving minimal evidence. It was a warning as much as a crime, a demonstration that the murderer could operate beyond expectation. Hamish crouched beside the cleat, examining the smear. It was small, almost insignificant, but enough to suggest a struggle. The lack of footprints leading to the skiff hinted that Morag had been taken swiftly, perhaps at night, or perhaps in collusion with someone she trusted, or feared. Hamish's mind raced. The disappearance was connected to the first murder. The same patterns emerged: precise timing, manipulation, and psychological pressure. The constable arrived, breathless and frantic. She's missing. What do we do?" Hamish stood, his gaze sweeping the harbour, the houses, the shadows that stretched along the quay. "We don't panic," he said, though his voice carried the weight of urgency. "We assume the worst, and we prepare for the next move, because whoever did this is counting on surprise, counting on mistakes." He turned to the villagers, scanning faces for hints of fear or deceit. Ewan Ross looked stricken but guarded, as if rehearsing innocence. A young boy clutched his mother's hand, whispering that he had seen someone lurking near the dock. Hamish filed the fragment away, knowing it could be exaggeration, or truth obscured by fear. Returning to the skiff, Hamish noticed a subtle detail that others had missed. The rope tying the boat to the dock had been tampered with, frayed in a precise manner, almost surgically, as if to suggest sloppiness while concealing skill. Whoever had done this knew boats, knew tides, knew timing, and they had left the faintest trace of a fingerprint on the cleat, smudged enough to avoid detection at a casual glance. A realization sharpened in Hamish's mind. This wasn't merely about killing or hiding evidence, it was about control, about sending a message. The first murder had been a lure, the vanished note and coin had been a distraction. And now, with Morag gone, the killer had escalated, forcing Hamish to act not just as a detective, but as a guardian. He traced the edge of the harbour, noting the slipways, the storage sheds, and the faint tracks along the frozen ground. Whoever had taken Morag had planned for every contingency. Hamish's pulse steadied. This was a test, a puzzle with higher stakes, and the clues were more subtle than ever. The wind tugged at his coat, carrying the scent of sea and smoke, of peat and salt. Hamish clenched his jaw, turning his mind over the possibilities. He had to anticipate the next move, predict the next deception, or risk another life lost. The murderer was ahead by several steps, and the game had changed. It was no longer about uncovering the past. It was about preventing the next shadow from claiming its prey. Hamish looked out over the dark water, feeling the tension tighten like a drawn bow. Morag's disappearance had altered everything. The investigation had become urgent, dangerous, and personal, and he knew that the killer, still unseen, was watching him, waiting for a slip, counting on fear. The next moment would be critical, and every choice he made now would determine whether the shadow could strike again, or finally be revealed. Hamish returned to the Calder house later that afternoon, the wind sharp in his ears, carrying the smell of brine and smoke. The village had begun to settle again, but an uneasy hush lingered, a shared tension that whispered of fear and secrets. He paced slowly through the sitting room, eyes sweeping the surfaces, the fireplace, the table where the note and coin had vanished. Something had been overlooked, something so small it seemed trivial, but in Hamish's experience, it was always the smallest things that told the truest story. He crouched by the hearth, running a finger along the polished edge of the mantel, and noticed it, a faint scratch, almost imperceptible, running parallel to the edge. He had seen it before, earlier in the empty house when the coin had still been in place, but now, in light of Morag's disappearance, it seemed to resonate differently. It wasn't a mark of carelessness, it was deliberate, a subtle signature repeated in other locations he had barely registered, the placement of chairs, the skew of the pen, the angle of the half-empty glass. Hamish's mind raced as he connected the dots. Each random detail, the warmth of the coin, the unfinished note, the frayed rope at the skiff, even the faint smear of blood, was part of a repeating sequence, a pattern of orchestration. The killer had left traces not by accident, but as a language of control. He saw now that the first murder, the missing evidence, and Morag's disappearance were not isolated acts. They were carefully choreographed, each step building upon the last, creating a rhythm only visible to someone who knew how to watch closely. He replayed the conversations, the subtle hesitations, the almost imperceptible shifts in posture. Morag's flick of the fingers, Ewan's over-eager insistence, the doctor's nervous adjustments, all lined up like punctuation in the silent script the murderer had written. The pattern was psychological as much as physical, and Hamish realized that the criminal was using both to manipulate perception, to control what others saw and believed. Hamish moved to the table where the note had sat, imagining the words written in haste or deliberation. "I promise I will," he whispered, letting the cadence of the unfinished sentence echo in his mind. The timing of the pen's pause, the pressure applied, the subtle feathering of the ink, it all pointed to someone trained, deliberate, someone who understood habit and expectation. The pattern was not just in the crime itself, but in the way it was presented, in the way it forced assumptions upon the witnesses. Then he noticed something else, a slight discoloration on the wood near the pen's previous resting place. A faint oily residue, easily dismissed, but it mirrored the scratch on the mantel. It suggested a movement, a gesture repeated in multiple locations, a nudge, a brush, a touch. The murderer had been careful to leave just enough of themselves visible to those who watched closely, creating a signature pattern that revealed intent and hand, even if it misled others about the who. Hamish straightened, a sense of clarity settling over him. The chaos, the disappearing evidence, the escalating danger, they were all part of the same design. The killer's method was no longer random. It was a deliberate choreography, a visible trail for those with patience and observation to follow. The pattern had been in plain sight all along, masked by the distraction of fear and assumption, waiting for someone to notice how each detail connected to the next. Outside, the wind carried the faintest echo of movement along the quay. Hamish's eyes narrowed, tracing shadows along the frozen harbour. The murderer was still watching, still counting on misdirection, but the detective had found the rhythm. The pattern was emerging, and with it came the knowledge that the next step could reveal not only the who but the how, and finally the why that had driven the shadow through Lochdu's streets. Hamish returned to the quiet of the Calder house as dusk fell, the faint glow of lamps casting long shadows across the room. He had traced the pattern of scratches, smudges, and subtle gestures through every corner, and now the rhythm of the killer's hand had begun to speak clearly. But the motive, the reason behind the careful orchestration, the staged evidence, the calculated vanishings, remained elusive. He sat heavily in the chair where Angus had once written his promise, letting his mind sift through the fragments he had gathered. The dark coin, the half-finished note, the vanished evidence, Morag's disappearance, and the old photograph linking past grudges to present danger. All of it suggested intelligence and cunning, but intelligence alone did not drive a killer. There had to be something deeper, something personal, intimate, hidden beneath layers of deception. Hamish's gaze fell again on Morag. Her reactions, subtle but telling, had betrayed knowledge beyond mere fear. She had been too familiar with the rhythms of manipulation, too adept at observing without revealing herself, and yet she had disappeared. Suddenly, a realization struck him. The crime was not just about removing obstacles or punishing old grievances. It was about control, but control on a level far more intimate than anyone had guessed. He stood and paced, piecing together the shadows of the past with the echoes of the present. Decades ago, a slight, trivial at the time, had seeded a festering obsession. Someone had watched Angus manipulate promises, saw him wield influence under the guise of generosity, and felt powerless, humiliated, and dismissed. That seed had grown quietly, nurtured by resentment, sharpened by opportunity, until it demanded satisfaction. The murders, the vanishing evidence, the staging, they were all instruments in a carefully composed performance, designed not to benefit financially or politically, but to assert dominance over a personal slight that had never been acknowledged. Hamish's eyes swept over the empty table again, imagining the killer's mindset, meticulous, patient, and driven by the compulsion to rewrite a narrative that had once humiliated them. The dark coin, the note, the careful cleaning, they were symbols of mastery, trophies of psychological victory, not material gain. Every step, every misdirection, every subtle threat had been orchestrated to prove that the killer could manipulate reality itself, bending the perceptions of everyone in the village, even the authorities. The pieces fell into place. Morag's disappearance, initially seeming like a continuation of the chaos, was the final test of control. She had been the witness closest to understanding the pattern, and removing her temporarily, or at least frightening her, ensured that the killer could continue their design uninterrupted. It wasn't a simple act of revenge or greed. It was a compulsion to correct an old imbalance, to impose a sense of justice only they could define. Hamish felt a chill run through him as he understood the depths of the psychology at play. This was someone who measured time and habit, who could predict reactions, who had planned decades in advance for a single moment of perceived reckoning. The extremity of their actions, murder, manipulation, the theft of evidence, was a reflection not of pragmatism, but of obsession. Ordinary crimes stem from motive that is immediate: money, power, fear. This, Hamish realized, was personal, intimate, and far more dangerous, because it could never truly be negotiated or rationalized. He stared at the blank space where the note had been, imagining the killer's mind at work, every small gesture, every stage detail, all part of a tableau to enforce their hidden sense of justice. The revelation weighed heavily. The villain's psychology was precise, methodical, and mercilessly driven by a need to rewrite the past. The murders had been extreme, yes, but necessary, in the mind of the killer, to restore balance to a world they felt had wronged them. Hamish drew a deep breath, feeling the tension of the pattern, the psychology, and the stakes converge. He now understood the depth of the danger, not just in solving the crimes, but in predicting the next move of a mind that would stop at nothing to assert its own vision of right. The hidden motive was no longer hidden, it was terrifyingly clear, and it demanded swift, careful action before the killer could strike again. Hamish had spent the day tracing patterns, revisiting old grudges and piecing together motives when a sudden thought struck him like a flare in the dimming light. Every detail pointed to a single obsessive mind, yet something about Morag's reactions, the way she had both guided and misled him, refused to settle neatly into the narrative. He returned to the Calder house as dusk bled into night, the wind whipping off the lock in sharp gusts that rattled the windows. He stepped into the sitting room and froze. On the mantelpiece, something gleamed faintly, a tiny, almost imperceptible slip of paper tucked behind the frame. Hamish reached for it with careful fingers. It was a note, hastily folded, with handwriting that was unmistakable, not Angus's, not Ewan's, not even the neat, deliberate curves he had studied in Morag's letters. The writing was jagged, uneven, almost childish, yet it carried a precision in its phrasing that belied its appearance. He unfolded it slowly. The words were brief, but they shattered the comfortable assumptions he had built over days. They never suspected me. I kept it hidden all along. Every move they blamed on another, every mistake I allowed. Perfect. Hamish's mind raced. He read the note again, noting the choice of words, the phrasing, the almost imperceptible slip in tense, the casual pride, the hidden glee. The killer had been right under everyone's noses, masquerading as an ally, even as they guided suspicion toward Ewan, toward Morag, toward imagined old grudges. This wasn't a newcomer, nor someone distant. It was someone intimately familiar with the patterns of the village, with the habits of everyone involved. He turned sharply to the shadows in the corner of the room, his instincts taut. There was no sound, yet he sensed presence. His mind retraced the subtle interactions over the past days, the constable's eagerness, the way Morag had sometimes deflected questions, even Ewan's too ready confessions. And then it clicked. The smallest, previously dismissed detail, a remark, offhand, made to a neighbour days before the murders, about how old habits die hard, and some things need correcting quietly. The voice had been casual, unremarkable, almost invisible, but the meaning was unmistakable in hindsight. The real mastermind was neither Morag nor Ewan, nor any of the outsiders Hamish had considered. It was someone trusted by the community, someone whose very presence had been assumed harmless. They had orchestrated the first murder, staged the disappearing evidence, manipulated Morag's disappearance, and exploited old grudges to divert suspicion. Every move had been calculated, each reaction anticipated. The web had been drawn perfectly to make the villagers and even the authorities believe in a simple motive, while the real hand remained invisible. Hamish's pulse quickened as he pieced together the final connections. The warmth of the coin, the scratches, the minor inconsistencies in gestures and speech, they all traced back to a single subtle orchestrator, the quiet neighbour who had offered help, who had checked on the Calder household under the guise of concern, who had never once drawn suspicion because everyone assumed they were too inconsequential to matter. The wind rattled the windows as he realized the stakes. The case, which seemed to be resolved, was still active. The killer had prepared for every contingency, leaving nothing to chance, and yet had revealed the faintest trace in their prideful note, believing it would be overlooked. Hamish knew that the final confrontation would require patience, cunning, and a careful reading of the smallest habits, because this was no ordinary criminal, but someone whose intellect and obsession rivaled his own. He folded the note carefully and tucked it into his coat. The last-minute twist had changed everything. The assumed resolution was a mirage, and the real test, the unveiling of the true villain, was still ahead. In the cold silence of the Calder house, Hamish felt the full weight of the challenge, knowing that one wrong move could allow the mastermind to vanish into the shadows and claim victory yet again. And he also knew, with absolute certainty, that he would not allow it. Hamish moved quietly through the shadows of the village, the note safely tucked in his coat pocket. Every step was deliberate, measured, eyes sweeping every corner, every doorway, every flicker of movement. The killer had orchestrated everything with care, but the faint arrogance in that note, the need to boast that no one suspected them, was the misstep Hamish had been waiting for. He followed the trail that no one else had seen, the pattern of scratches, the misaligned objects, the barely perceptible traces of warmth in the coin, all leading not to obvious anger or greed, but to someone who understood control and appearances more than anyone else in Lochdu. At the edge of the harbour, the faint sound of footsteps on ice made him pause. Morag had returned, pale, shaken, but unharmed. She looked at him with a mixture of relief and fear, her eyes darting to the water where the small skiff had drifted aimlessly. Hamish motioned for her to stay back, and continued alone toward the storage shed that had been overlooked until now. Inside, the faint scent of smoke and the subtle metallic tang of ink told him he was in the right place. And there, crouched in the shadows, was the person he least expected, the quiet neighbour, the one everyone assumed was harmless, who had checked on the Calders in the days before the murder. They froze as Hamish stepped forward, a mixture of surprise and feigned composure crossing their face. "I suppose you're wondering why I'm here," Hamish said evenly, stepping into the lamplight. "It isn't luck that brought me. It's the pattern. The scratches, the coin, the note, even the way the rope at the skiff was frayed. You underestimated the power of subtle observation." The neighbour's lips tightened. "You'll never prove it," they whispered, voice low but confident. Hamish shook his head slowly. "Oh, I've already pieced together everything. The coin's warmth betrayed timing. The note? Well, your pride in leaving it behind was the clue. Morag's reactions, the scratches on the mantel, the repeated gestures, they all spoke your hand. Every small detail you thought invisible I've seen, and every step you took to mislead the village only confirms your careful orchestration." For a moment the killer's mask cracked, revealing the obsession that had driven them to manipulate, threaten, and murder. They were meticulous, patient, brilliant, but human, and humans always leave one detail overlooked, one twitch, one moment of pride. Hamish had found it. Before the authorities arrived, the killer bolted, slipping into the snowy streets of Lochdu with a speed and familiarity that suggested years of knowing the village. Hamish pursued as far as he dared, but the shadows swallowed the figure, leaving nothing but footprints in fresh snow and a faint sense of unfinished business. The police later found no trace, and the village whispered about escape, about luck, about the cunning of someone who had walked among them unnoticed. Hamish returned to the Calder house, calm despite the unresolved ending. Morag followed, grateful yet shaken. He explained to her quietly how he had unravelled the case. The dark coin as a marker of deliberate handling, the note's tiny imperfections and timing as a boast, the scratches as repeated gestures, the subtle psychological reactions of those involved, all pieces of a puzzle that revealed the true culprit, even if they had managed to vanish before justice could be delivered in the conventional sense. Sometimes, Hamish said, gazing out at the frozen loch, justice isn't a handcuff or a trial. Sometimes it's understanding, observation, and knowing that the truth exists, even if the world can't see it yet. This person may have escaped us physically, but every step they took has been read, every manipulation noted, every obsession understood. That knowledge, that is a kind of justice in itself. Morag shivered, glancing at the shadows outside where the wind swept across the harbour. Do you think they'll strike again? Hamish's eyes narrowed, reflective but unshaken. Perhaps. But the pattern is no longer a secret. We've seen it. We understand it. And next time the shadow won't have anywhere left to hide. The village returned to its uneasy calm, the murders behind them, but the memory lingering. Justice had been served in the mind of the detective, if not in the hands of the law, and Hamish, as always, remained a step ahead, watching the patterns of people and shadows alike, prepared for whatever might emerge from the depths of Loch Dhu's long silent nights. The snow had stopped falling, leaving Loch Dhu coated in a fine silver frost that shimmered in the weak winter sunlight. Hamish walked slowly along the quiet streets, boots crunching softly on the frozen ground, the harbour glinting in the distance. Morag had returned safely to her home, and for the first time in days the village seemed to breathe again. Yet Hamish's eyes were sharp, scanning every shadow, every window, every movement. The killer might have vanished, but the questions, the subtle unease, remained. He passed the Calder house and paused at the doorway, glancing at the fireplace mantel where the scratches had once seemed insignificant. Something about them still niggled at him. They had fit into the pattern he had discerned, yes, but there had been a faint trace of something else, almost imperceptible, that had eluded even his careful scrutiny. A mark, a smudge, a detail so subtle it might have been dismissed by anyone else. He crouched, examining the edge of the wood with practised fingers, and noticed a faint residue, almost invisible, as if a hand had lingered there longer than it should have. Hamish frowned. It was nothing concrete, just a trace, but enough to prick the mind with suspicion. He rose and looked toward the loch, the wind carrying faint echoes across the frozen water. A thought whispered through his mind. The killer's pattern had been intricate, obsessive and precise. But had it truly ended? The meticulous streak of control, the tiny boasts left in notes, the psychological manipulation, all suggested a mind that might plan further, somewhere, somehow, waiting for another opportunity. He walked past the village square, noting the familiar faces of neighbours returning to ordinary routines. Their relief was visible, but Hamish detected the tremor beneath the calm, the unspoken awareness that someone dangerous had walked among them and could return. He wondered if the shadow would simply vanish, or if it would resurface, testing him and the village once more. The thought was unsettling, yet strangely comforting. The world of mystery and human cunning never truly ends. As he reached the edge of the harbour, the sunlight glinting off the ice, Hamish paused again. A small scrap of paper floated near a piling, caught in a frozen ripple of water. He bent to retrieve it, noting the faint scrawl, a series of numbers, almost random, with no signature. A code, a clue. Perhaps a message left intentionally, or perhaps a coincidence, but Hamish knew better than to dismiss the smallest hints. Even in a case that seemed concluded, the residue of intelligence, of intent, often lingered in the most innocuous corners. He pocketed the scrap and straightened, letting his gaze drift over the village rooftops, the loch, and the distant hills. Justice had been partially served. Morag was safe, the murders explained. the manipulations uncovered. Yet the sense of unfinished business remained, a shadow stretching beyond the warmth of resolution. In Loch Dhu, patterns and secrets ran deep, and Hamish knew the next thread could emerge at any moment. With a final glance back at the Calder house, he started walking toward the outskirts, steps deliberate, eyes alert. The village resumed its quiet rhythm behind him, but he remained conscious of the invisible currents, the faint hints of human cunning that might yet twist events into chaos again. In the back of his mind he replayed every detail, every gesture, every smudge and note, ready as always to follow wherever the next mystery might lead. Loch Dhu might rest for a moment, but in the shadows someone or something was waiting. And Hamish knew, as he walked away along the frost-lined streets, that the game was far from over. The village's calm was only temporary, the peace fragile, and the detective's work, as ever, was never truly complete.